The war room of the Vorkai Dominion smelled like old iron and cold stone. It was a wide, dark chamber deep inside the command moon of Zathara Prime, carved out of black rock by the claws of 100,000 workers 3 centuries ago. The walls were covered in star maps. Glowing lines showed the borders of the Dominion, stretching across 43 star systems, each one taken by force, each one added to the growing empire like a trophy nailed to a wall. True Commander Zethrak stood at the center of the room, his scaled arms folded behind his back, his yellow eyes moving slowly across the newest map on the table. He was tall, even for a Vorkai. His dark green scales were tight and smooth, a sign of good health and high status. He had fought in 9 campaigns. He had taken 6 worlds. He was by any measure one of the most decorated officers in the entire Dominion fleet, and he had just been given the most boring assignment of his career. "Yes, the Sol system," said Fleet Master Vorun from across the table. He was older, heavier, with pale scales and a voice like gravel being crushed. He pointed one claw at the small yellow star on the map. "Third planet, called Earth by its inhabitants. One dominant species. They call themselves humans." Sethric looked at the planet. Small, blue and green. Nothing remarkable. "How long have they had space travel?" "Just over 200 years, Vorun said. Zethrak almost laughed. 200 years. And the Vorkai had been traveling between stars for over 3,000. Some of the species they had conquered had been flying ships for 500 years, 700 years, even 1,000, and they had all fallen. A species with barely 2 centuries of space travel was not a military problem. It was an administrative one. "Why are we even discussing this?" Zethrak asked. Varun's expression didn't change. "Because the humans sit on a system rich in resources, metals, gases, biological material, water in quantities we haven't seen in 2 sectors. The Dominion wants it. The High Council has decided that annexation is the correct path." "Annexation," Zethrak repeated. "You mean conquest?" "We prefer the cleaner word," Vorun said flatly. "You will take a mid-range fleet, 15 capital ships, 40 support vessels, 300,000 ground troops held in reserve on the carriers. You will enter their system, destroy any military resistance, if they even have military resistance worth mentioning, and broadcast the standard terms of surrender." Zethric nodded slowly. It was not a prestigious mission. The High Council had not sent their best fleet. They had not sent their newest ships. This was the kind of task given to capable officers who needed to stay busy between real wars. It was, in a quiet way, an insult wrapped in a uniform. But Zethrak was a soldier. He accepted his orders without complaint. What he could not accept, however, was the small thing that happened the day before his fleet was scheduled to depart. He was in his private quarters reviewing the mission files when a low-ranking communications officer knocked at his door and delivered a data chip. On it was a recorded message from an Alhari diplomat. The Alhari were an old species, ancient, by most standards, thin and pale with large dark eyes and voices that sounded like wind through hollow pipes. They had never joined the Vorkai Dominion. They existed in a kind of careful neutrality, observing, recording, never fighting. They were historians more than anything else. Zethrak played the message mostly out of mild curiosity. The Alhari diplomat on the recording was an older one. Its name, translated into Vorkai speech, was something close to Listener of Fading Stars. It sat very still in the recording, its long fingers folded together, its dark eyes looking directly at the camera, with an expression that Zethrak found difficult to read. "We speak to you as a courtesy," the diplomat said in accented but clear Vorkai. "We have observed humanity for a long time, longer than they have observed themselves in some ways. We are aware that your Dominion intends to move against their system. We are making this communication not to interfere, but to inform. We have watched many species encounter humanity for the first time. We have watched the meetings go badly. We would encourage your high command to reconsider." Zethrak paused the recording. He stared at the face of the old alien for a moment. Then he pressed play again. "Humans are not what their age suggests," the diplomat continued. 200 years in space is a short time, but the species itself is very old. They have been at war with each other for most of their recorded history. Every generation on every continent of their home world, they fought. with stones, then metal, then fire, then weapons that split the atom itself. They nearly destroyed their own world more than once. They did not stop. They never stopped. They simply got better. The diplomat paused as though choosing the next words carefully. When they finally unified and looked outward, they did not do so with wonder alone. They did it with memory. Every lesson of every war they had ever fought against each other, they kept it. They studied it. They built from it. We have seen what humans do when their home is threatened. We chose not to be their enemy. We strongly suggest you make the same choice. The message ended. Zethrak sat in silence for a moment. Then he set the data chip on his desk and went back to his mission files. He was not afraid of an old alien's ghost story. The El Hari were pacifists. They had no military, and they understood war the way a person who had never been in a river understood swimming, theoretically from a safe distance. Their warnings were the warnings of those who had never truly fought. He had fought. He knew what victory looked like, and humanity, by every measurement available, was not ready for what was coming. His fleet departed the following morning. The jump through deep space was long and quiet. The Zethrak spent most of it reviewing human military records that Vorkai intelligence had managed to gather. Most of it was old. Transmissions intercepted years ago, some satellite footage, fragments of data from probe drones that had skirted the outer edge of the Sol system without being detected. The humans had a military. Of course they did. It was called the United Earth Defense Command, UEDC for short. They had warships, not many by Dominion standards, but present. They had weapons platforms around their home planet and the red planet next to it, the one they called Mars. They had some kind of large installation on their moon. Nothing alarming. Nothing that suggested a species ready to fight a proper war. His senior weapons officer, a scarred veteran named Kreth, reviewed the same files and came to the same conclusion. They have approximately 40 confirmed warships, Kreth said one evening in the fleet command room. Perhaps more hidden somewhere. But even doubling that number, they cannot match our firepower. The moment we destroy their outer defenses and hold position above their homeworld, they will negotiate. They always negotiate, Zethrak agreed. The Pelhari had 200 ships, another officer said from across the table. They lasted 9 days. Humans won't last 6, Zethrak said. He believed it completely. But 2 days out from the Sol system, something small happened that no one talked about afterward, because no one wanted to be the one who first mentioned it. The long-range sensors picked up nothing unusual. The outer system was quiet, but when the fleet crossed into the boundary of the Sol system, when the yellow star grew bright enough on the screens to be clearly visible, the communications channels went silent. Not human channels. All channels. There were no panic transmissions from Earth. No emergency broadcasts. No desperate calls to any known galactic body asking for help. No military chatter. No civilian chatter. Nothing. The system simply sat there, calm and quiet, as though it had not noticed that a Vorkai invasion fleet had just crossed its threshold. One of Zethrak's junior officers, a young male named Seath, who was on his first deep space campaign, looked up from his sensor station with a faint expression of discomfort. "Commander," he said carefully, "should they not be transmitting by now? They would have detected us at the boundary. Their detection technology is sufficient for that." "They know we're here," Kreth said flatly. "Then why is no one speaking?" Seath asked. No one answered him. The question sat in the air of the command deck for a moment, and then everyone quietly went back to their stations, because the silence had no good answer, and everyone preferred not to think about it too hard. Zethrak said nothing. He watched the screens. He watched the small blue planet growing slowly larger in the forward display. He told himself the silence was cowardice. He told himself the humans were too frightened to transmit, too disorganized to respond with anything coherent. He told himself everything he needed to believe in order to keep his certainty intact. But in a deep, quiet corner of himself, the part that had survived 9 campaigns not just through strength, but through instinct, something small and cold had begun to stir. Not fear, not yet. Just the faint, an early feeling that something was not quite right. He dismissed it. He had a fleet of 15 capital ships. He had 40 support vessels. He had 300,000 ground troops waiting in their carrier holds. He was the sword of the Vorkai Dominion, and he had been sent to take one small, blue, unremarkable world from a species that had barely learned to leave it. There was nothing to be afraid of. He almost believed it. Outside the viewports, the Sol system stretched wide and still around the fleet, ancient and cold and patient, and the small blue planet at its heart turned slowly in the dark, saying nothing at all. It did not need to speak. It had already begun. And somewhere in the silence, humanity was watching every single ship, counting every single gun, and waiting the way it had always waited, for exactly the right moment. The bunker beneath the Swiss Alps had no windows. That was by design. The United Earth Defense Command had built it 3 kilometers underground, behind 40 meters of reinforced concrete and steel, inside a mountain that had stood for millions of years before the first human ever looked up at the stars and wondered what lived there. The bunker did not need windows. It had screens, hundreds of them, covering every wall of the main operations floor, each one showing a different piece of the solar system in real time. Satellites, deep-range sensors, drone feeds, thermal imaging from platforms hidden in the asteroid belt, and one very large screen at the front of the room that showed the Vorkai fleet in clean, precise detail. Admiral Mara Chen stood in front of that screen with a cup of cold coffee in her hand and said nothing. She was not a tall woman. She was in her late 50s, with short gray hair cut close to her head and dark eyes that had the particular quality of stillness that only came from having seen too many things too many times. She wore her uniform without decoration, which was unusual for someone of her rank. Most admirals collected medals the way old sailors collected scars. Chen had earned plenty of both. She just didn't see the point of wearing them on her chest when there was work to do. Around her, the operations floor was full. 200 analysts, technicians, communications officers, and tactical advisors sat at their stations in long rows, watching their own screens, running their own calculations, speaking in low voices into headsets. The room hummed with the quiet energy of people who were very afraid but very professional, which is a specific kind of energy that only military people understand. A young lieutenant named Patel approached Chen from the left. He was 26 years old and had graduated top of his class from the Mars Defense Academy 18 months ago. He was good at his job. He was also, at this particular moment, visibly struggling to keep the tension off his face. "So, Admiral," he said, "the Vorkai fleet has crossed the boundary threshold. 15 capital ships confirmed, 41 support vessels, 3 of which are carrier class. Based on the size of those carriers, our best estimate for ground troops is somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000. Chen took a sip of her cold coffee. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Patel waited. After a moment, he said, "Admiral, your orders?" "My orders stand," Chen said. She did not look away from the main screen. "Let them come." Patel hesitated. It was a very brief hesitation, barely a second, but Chen noticed it the way she noticed everything. She looked at him then, and her expression was not unkind. "You want to ask something?" she said. "No, Admiral, Ask it." Patel straightened slightly. "We have 42 warships in defensive positions between here and Mars. The Vorkai have 15 capital ships alone. Each of their capital ships outguns our entire forward line. If they push hard and fast, we lose those 42 ships in the first engagement, and then they have a clear path to Earth." He stopped, started again. "I want to understand the plan, Admiral. I'm not questioning the plan. I just want to understand it." Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She almost smiled. "How old are you, Patel?" 26. "An Admiral. Do you know when the first recorded organized battle in human history took place?" He blinked. No, Admiral, not exactly. Around 5,000 years ago," Chen said, "in a place called Mesopotamia. Before that, humans were already fighting each other, just without the paperwork." She turned back to the screen. For 5,000 years of recorded history, and probably 10,000 years before that, humans fought. Wars over food, wars over land, wars over water, wars over ideas, over religions, over borders that someone drew on a map, and someone else decided they didn't like. We fought with rocks. We fought with swords. We fought with guns and bombs and things that could level entire cities in a single second. She paused. Every single one of those wars taught us something. We wrote it down. We studied it. We made doctrine out of it. We built institutions around it. When the last World War ended and we finally stopped fighting each other and started working together, do you know what we did with all of that knowledge? Patel was very still. We kept it, he said quietly. We kept it, Chen confirmed. We kept every lesson, every mistake, every strategy that worked, and every strategy that got people killed. We put it all into UEDC, and UEDC spent the next 150 years applying it to a completely new question. What do we do if someone from out there comes down here and tries to take what's ours? She took another sip of coffee. Those 42 ships out there aren't our defense, Lieutenant. They're our bait. Patel stared at her. Get back to your station, she said, not unkindly. It's going to be a long few days. 3 levels below the main operations floor, in a room that did not appear on any official schematic of the bunker, a much smaller group of people sat around a single table. There were 8 of them. Each one commanded one of the 8 most classified assets in human history. They were the War Titan commanders. The project had started 60 years ago under a different name, in a different political climate. And when the first alien signals had been detected and analyzed and determined to be not greetings, but navigational data. Ships moving between stars, none of them heading toward Earth yet, but the math suggesting that eventually something would. The question that followed was simple and brutal. If something came, and it was bigger than us, what could we do about it? The answer the UEDC engineers and weapons designers had eventually arrived at was not elegant. It was not subtle. It was very, very human. Build something bigger. The War Titans were not fast ships. They were not graceful ships. They did not look like the sleek, swept vessels that appeared in popular entertainment. They were enormous, dense, brutal constructions of layered armor, redundant systems, and enough firepower to crack open a moon. The smallest of them was 3 kilometers long. The largest was nearly 5. Each one had taken 20 years to build, Shudra assembled in the deep shadow of Jupiter, where long-range sensors from outside the system would have difficulty detecting the heat signatures of the construction yards. There were 8 of them. The oldest was called the UEDS Nemesis. It had been commissioned 40 years ago and had never fired a weapon in actual combat. None of them had. They had been built for exactly this kind of moment, and until this moment, that moment had not come. Commander Yusuf Adeyemi sat at the head of the small table. He was the captain of the Nemesis. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a calm face and hands that were completely still on the table in front of him, which was the thing people always noticed about him first. His hands were always still. The Vorkai fleet is inside the boundary, said the woman to his left, Commander Irina Vaslov of the UEDS Titan's Wrath. They'll reach Mars orbit within 2 days at their current speed. They'll slow down before that, said another commander, a lean older man named Torres who captained the UEDS Ironwall. They'll want to assess. They'll hit our forward line, punch through it, and then pause to look around. That's what every aggressive fleet commander does. Win the first fight, then look at what's next. Good, Adeyemi said. We hold position behind Jupiter until Chen's signal, Vaslov said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. Until her signal, Adeyemi agreed. The room was quiet for a moment. 8 people, 8 ships, and enough collective firepower to end the Vorkai invasion before it properly started. Sitting in the dark behind a gas giant, invisible, patient, waiting. One of the younger Titan commanders, a woman named Okafor who captained the UEDS Endless Night, leaned forward slightly. Do we know if they have any intelligence on us? On the Titans? No confirmed intelligence, Adeyemi said. Our analysis team believes they scanned the outer system and found nothing unusual. The Jupiter shadow is holding. So when we come out, they won't know what they're looking at, Torres said. Not at first. Okafor nodded slowly. And when they figure it out? Adeyemi looked at her with his still hands and his calm face. That, he said simply, is the point. Back on the main operations floor, Admiral Chen watched the Vorkai fleet move deeper into the solar system. Her 42 warships fell back ahead of them in a slow, deliberate retreat, careful to look disorganized, careful to look afraid, careful to look like exactly what the Vorkai expected to see. A weaker force running from a stronger one. It was the oldest trick in the book. Literally. Sun Tzu had written about it 4,000 years ago, and it still worked, because arrogance was a constant, and an arrogance always saw what it expected to see. She watched Zethrak's fleet follow her ships like a hand reaching for something it thought was already in its grasp. She thought about the Elhari diplomat who had contacted them quietly 3 months ago, when the Vorkai's intentions had become clear. The Elhari had been gentle and careful with their words, but the message underneath had been plain. The Vorkai were coming. They were not going to listen to reason. And the Elhari were deeply, genuinely sorry that they could not do more to help. Chen had thanked the diplomat and told her not to worry. The diplomat had looked at her with those large dark eyes and said very softly, "You are not afraid." "No," Chen had said. "Why?" the diplomat asked. Chen had thought about it for a moment. "Because we've been here before," she said. "Not with aliens, but the situation, outnumbered, outgunned. Someone bigger coming to take what's ours. We've been there. Hundreds of times. And we're still here." The diplomat had been quiet for a long time after that. Now in the bunker beneath the Alps, Chen set down her empty coffee cup and watched the trap she had spent 3 years preparing, slowly, quietly close around a fleet that had no idea it was already inside it. The asteroid belt was waiting, the drones were armed, the mines were live. And behind Jupiter, in the cold and the dark, 8 war titans sat with their engines warm and their weapons charged, crewed by the children of the most persistently violent and stubbornly surviving species the galaxy had ever accidentally produced. Humanity was ready. It had always been ready. It had simply been waiting for someone to give it a reason. The first battle lasted 40 minutes. It happened near Mars in the wide empty space between the red planet and the inner asteroid belt, where the human forward line had stopped retreating and turned to fight. Zethrak had expected this. A cornered force always turns. It is instinct. It is pride. It doesn't matter what species you are. When you have run as far as you can run, something in the biology takes over and makes you face what is coming. He had allowed his fleet to accelerate. He had allowed his capital ships to open up with their long-range cannons. He had watched the human warships take hits, lose shields, break formation. 3 of their ships had exploded in the first 10 minutes. 5 more had pulled back hard, trailing fire and leaking atmosphere into the void. It had looked from the Vorkai command deck exactly like a victory. Zethrak had watched it with satisfaction and told Kreth to push the support vessels up on the flanks. "Drive them back toward their home planet," he had said. "Let them run again. We'll let them tire themselves out." Kreth had relayed the order. The fleet had moved forward. What none of them had noticed, not Zethrak, not Kreth, not any of the experienced officers on the command deck, was that the retreating human ships were not running in panic. They were running in a very specific direction, a very specific corridor, a narrow lane through space that cut straight into the densest part of the asteroid belt, through a region the human navigational charts called the Shepherd's Pass, a gap between 2 large rotating clusters of rock and metal that was wide enough for a warship but tight enough that a fleet would have to move through it in a long, thin line rather than a wide formation. The Vorkai fleet chased them in. For the first few minutes, everything was still fine. The asteroids were rocks. Large rocks, some of them, tumbling slowly in their ancient orbits, but rocks nonetheless. Sensors showed nothing unusual. No hidden ships, no weapons platforms. There's no sign of any military presence. Just stone and metal and the cold silence of space. Then the rocks moved. Not all of them. Not randomly. Specific ones in specific places shifted with a deliberate mechanical precision that had nothing to do with orbital mechanics. Panels opened in the surfaces of 7 large asteroids simultaneously, and from those panels came things that were not rocks at all. Automated weapons platforms, squat and ugly, and bristling with railgun barrels and missile tubes, each one the size of a small building, each one already locked onto a target before the Vorkai sensors had even registered what they were looking at. The first volley hit before anyone on the Vorkai fleet could react. It was not the firepower of the platforms that caused the damage. It was the angle. The Vorkai fleet was in a line, compressed by the narrow pass, and the platforms had been positioned on both sides. Every shot that came in hit something. There was no room to evade. There was no wide formation to spread the damage across. Ship after ship shuddered and burned as railgun rounds punched through hulls that had been designed for open space combat. Not this kind of close, ugly, channeled ambush. Zethrak grabbed the edge of his command console as his flagship rocked from a near miss. "Weapons free," he shouted. "All ships, weapons free. Destroy those platforms." The Vorkai fleet fired back. They were good at fighting. They were experienced and well-trained, and their ships were powerful. Within minutes, they had identified and destroyed 4 of the 7 weapons platforms. The other 3 went dark on their own, retreating back behind their asteroid panels, hiding again. But while the fleet was focused on the platforms, the mines woke up. They had been sitting in the asteroid belt for 11 years, small, cold, completely inert, scattered through the rocks in patterns that made them look like debris. In 11 years of waiting, drawing no power, producing no heat signature, doing nothing at all, just sitting, the way a patient thing sits when it knows that eventually what it is waiting for will come. The activation signal came from the bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, sent by a young technician named Reyes, who pressed a single key on her console when Admiral Chen gave her the nod. 412 mines activated at the same time. They did not all explode immediately. They were smarter than that. They activated their tiny onboard computers, assessed the positions of the nearest Vorkai ships, and began to move. Slowly, carefully, drifting on small cold gas thrusters that produced almost no detectable signature, threading through the rocks, closing the distance to their targets in the same patient way that everything in this part of the solar system had been designed to operate. Patient, quiet, waiting for the right moment. The Vorkai damage control teams were still working on the hits from the weapons platforms when the first mine reached a support vessel on the left flank and detonated against its engine housing. Then a second mine hit a capital ship's forward shield projector. Then 3 more went off in quick succession along the right flank. And suddenly the Vorkai fleet was not fighting a retreating line of warships. It was fighting the asteroid belt itself, and the asteroid belt was winning. "We'll pull back," Kreth was shouting somewhere behind Zethrak. "Commander, we need to pull back out of the pass." Zethrak was already thinking the same thing. "All ships, reverse thrust. Get us out of this corridor. Now." It took 12 minutes to extract the fleet from the Shepherd's Pass, and those 12 minutes cost them 6 ships. Not destroyed outright, the human weapons were not quite powerful enough for that, but crippled, engines dead, weapons offline, hulls breached and patched with emergency foam, while crew members in suits scrambled through smoking corridors trying to keep their ships from coming apart entirely. When the fleet finally cleared the pass and spread out into open space again, Zethrak stood on his command deck and looked at his damage reports in silence. 6 ships out of action, 11 more with significant damage, casualties in the thousands, and they had not yet reached Earth. They had not yet fought a single proper fleet engagement. They had been chewed up by rocks and machines and things that had been sitting in the dark waiting for them. And the human warships that had led them into the pass were already gone, already retreated again, already somewhere else, still running. Still running. Something about that made Zethrak's jaw tighten. They were not running because they were afraid. That much was becoming clear. Every retreat had been too clean, too controlled, too precise. Afraid things ran in all directions. These ships ran in exactly the direction they wanted the Vorkai to follow. And the Vorkai had followed, every single time. He turned to Kreth, who was standing very still with the damage report in his hands and an expression on his face that Zethrak had never seen there before. Kreth had been in 7 campaigns. He had fought species that had resisted hard, and species that had fought dirty, and species that had done strange and unexpected things before ultimately losing. But the expression on his face right now was not the look of a man dealing with unexpected tactics. It was the look of a man who was beginning to wonder if he had fundamentally misunderstood something important. They planned this, Kreth said. His voice was flat. All of it. The retreat, the pass, the platforms, the mines. And they planned all of it before we even entered the system. Yes, Zethrak said. How long ago? Zethrak looked at the asteroid belt on his sensors, at the positions of the weapons platforms, at the spread pattern of the mines. He thought about the engineering time required to hollow out an asteroid and install a weapons platform inside it. He thought about the logistics of seeding 400 mines through a debris field without anyone noticing. Yes, he thought about how long you would have to know that someone was coming before you could do all of that. Years, he said quietly. They have been preparing this for years. The command deck was very quiet. Seath, the young officer who had asked about the silence 2 days ago, looked up from his sensor station. His face was pale under his scales. Commander, he said, I have a contact, near Jupiter. Something large. I am not sure what I'm looking at. A ship? Kreth asked. And I think so, Seath said slowly. But the mass reading doesn't... He stopped, recalibrated his instruments, looked at the reading again. It doesn't match anything in the database. Unknown configuration, Zethrak said. Could be a station, a platform. It's moving, Seath said. Everyone on the command deck turned to look at him. It's moving away from Jupiter, Seath continued, and his voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. Toward us, slowly, very slowly. He paused. Commander, the mass reading on this contact is... He looked up from his screen. His yellow eyes were wide. It is bigger than anything I have ever seen on a sensor display. Zethrak walked to the sensor station and looked at the screen himself. He looked at the mass reading. He looked at the size estimate. He looked at the trajectory. Then he looked up at the forward viewport, at the dark space between his damaged fleet and the massive orange sphere of Jupiter. And he waited. For a long time there was nothing, just the dark and the stars and the distant glow of the gas giant. And then slowly, something moved out of the shadow. It did not appear all at once. It emerged gradually, the way a continent emerges from fog when a ship approaches it. First the edges, then the mass, then the full, terrible scale of it becoming clear only when the mind had no choice but to accept what the eyes were seeing. It was a ship. It was the largest ship Zethrak had ever seen in his life, larger than anything the Vorkai had ever built, larger than anything he had believed any species could build and move through space. Its hull was dark gray, almost black, scorched in places from what must have been its own weapons tests, layered in thick plates of armor that overlapped each other like the scales of something ancient and massive. Along its dorsal surface, running almost its entire length, were railgun spines, dozens of them, each one longer than a Vorkai capital ship. Its engine arrays at the rear glowed a deep, steady blue, enormous and unhurried. It moved through space the way mountains moved in geological time, slowly with absolute certainty, with the complete indifference of something that had no reason to hurry because nothing in its path was going to stop it. Zethrak stood on his command deck and stared at it. Around him, every officer on the deck had gone completely still. No one spoke, no one moved. Several of them, without realizing they were doing it, had taken one small step backward from their stations, the way living things take one small step backward when they see something that rewrites their understanding of what the world contains. The comm system crackled, and then a human voice came through, a woman's voice, calm and unhurried. As speaking in clear and accented but perfectly understandable Vorkai, and it said, "You came to the wrong system. You have one opportunity to leave it." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Zethrak had ever heard. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the ship on the screen. He looked at his damage reports. He looked at the 6 crippled vessels sitting behind his fleet. When he thought about the mines and the platforms and the years of preparation, and the Alhari diplomat, with her large dark eyes saying words he had dismissed because he had been too proud to hear them. He thought about all of those things, and then, because he was a soldier, and because his pride was stronger than his instinct, and because he had never in 9 campaigns backed down from anything, he made the worst decision of his life. He opened the fleet-wide channel. All ships, he said. To attack. The Vorkai fleet moved forward. It did so the way a wounded animal charges, not with confidence but with desperation, dressed up as aggression. The capital ships pushed to the front, their cannons already cycling up to firing temperature, their shield arrays pulling maximum power from engines that were still hot from the asteroid belt engagement. The support vessels spread out on the flanks in a standard attack formation, one filling the space between the capital ships like fingers wrapping around something. It was a good formation. It was a textbook formation. It had worked against every species the Vorkai had ever fought. The thing ahead of them did not react to the formation. It did not change course. It did not accelerate. It did not open any visible weapon ports or shift its profile or do any of the things that a ship being charged by an enemy fleet would normally do. It just kept coming. Slow and steady and absolutely certain. Zethrak watched it on the main screen and felt the first real cracks forming in the wall of certainty he had built around himself over 9 campaigns and 3 decades of war. The cracks were small. He pushed them back. He focused on the tactical picture. Numbers, distances, firing solutions. These were things he understood. These were things that made sense. Weapons range in 4 minutes, Kreth reported from the tactical station. His voice was professional and controlled, but it was the kind of control that required visible effort. Capital guns will have a firing solution on the contact in 3. Target the engine arrays first, Zethrak said. Kill its propulsion. Then we work on the hull. Understood. The range closed. 3 minutes. 2. The thing on the screen grew larger with every passing second, and with every passing second, the scale of it became harder to process. The mind kept trying to place it in a familiar category. A station, a platform, a very large freighter, and kept failing because it did not belong in any of those categories. It was a warship. It was clearly, unmistakably, a warship. But it was a warship built by a species that had looked at every warship ever constructed and decided that all of them were too small. At 2 minutes to weapons range, Zethrak's weapons officer, a precise and experienced female named Veth, looked up from her targeting console with an expression that she could not quite keep neutral. "Commander," she said carefully, "I am having difficulty with the targeting parameters." "Explain." "Our targeting system is designed to lock onto vessels within a certain size range. The contact," she paused, "the contact exceeds the upper boundary of that range. The system is trying to treat it as a terrain feature rather than a target. I am having to input manual overrides." Zethrak stared at her. "It is too large for our targeting computers." "Yes, Commander." A sound went around the command deck. Not a word, not quite a gasp. Just a small collective sound that people make when something they have been trying not to believe becomes impossible to deny. "Manual targeting," Zethrak said. "Do it manually. It is large enough that even without lock-on, we cannot miss." "Yes, Commander." Veth bent back over her console, her hands moving quickly. 1 minute to weapons range. The Vorkai capital ships opened fire. 12 capital-grade energy cannons fired simultaneously, each one carrying enough power to cut through the hull of a standard warship in a single shot. The beams crossed the distance between the fleet and the contact in fractions of a second. Bright lines of destructive energy cutting through the black of space, which is straight and true and completely unavoidable. They hit the armor of the UEDS Nemesis, and the Nemesis kept coming. The shots had hit. There was no question of that. Veth's instruments confirmed impact. The energy readings confirmed transfer. The beams had struck the forward armor plating of the human vessel dead center, exactly where they had been aimed, with full power behind them. The armor had absorbed them, not deflected, not shielded, absorbed. The layered plates of titanium ceramic composite that covered the Nemesis, like the skin of something ancient, had taken 12 capital-grade energy cannon shots at close range and distributed the energy across the plating system the way thick stone distributes the blow of a hammer, spreading it, bleeding it off, turning a concentrated killing strike into a broad thermal event that the cooling systems beneath the plates handled without any apparent difficulty. A small section of the forward plating glowed orange for a few seconds. Then it faded. The Nemesis kept coming. Zethrak heard someone on his command deck make a sound that he had never heard a Vorkai soldier make in combat before. It was a small sound. It was the sound a person makes when the part of their brain responsible for survival overrides the part responsible for military discipline and produces something involuntary and honest and very afraid. He did not reprimand the person who made it. He was not certain it had not been him. "Fire again," he said. "Everything we have. Continuous fire." The fleet fired again, and again, and again. Cannon after cannon, missile salvo after missile salvo. The full weight of a Vorkai mid-range invasion fleet pouring energy and ordnance into the approaching vessel in a continuous storm of fire that lit up the space between Jupiter and the asteroid belt, like a small sun being born and dying over and over in rapid succession. The Nemesis took it all. Plates glowed and cooled. One section of the upper hull showed a long, bright scar where a sustained missile barrage had stripped the outer layer of plating. Tiny debris drifted away from the impact sites. Fragments of the outer armor, spent and sacrificed, doing exactly the job they had been designed to do. The ship's profile changed in small ways as it absorbed punishment, the way a fighter's face changes over the course of a long bout, taking on the record of what it had endured. But it did not stop. It did not slow. It did not veer off course or attempt to evade or show any sign that the punishment it was absorbing was anything more than an inconvenience. And then it fired back. The railguns along the Nemesis's dorsal surface had been charging since the moment the Vorkai fleet had opened fire. 44 of them, running the full length of the ship's spine, each one accelerating a tungsten alloy projectile to a fraction of the speed of light along a magnetic track 300 meters long. And they did not fire all at once. They fired in a rolling sequence, one after another in rapid succession, so that the stream of fire was continuous rather than a single devastating volley. A sustained drumbeat of kinetic destruction rather than one massive blow. The first shot hit a Vorkai capital ship on the port side of the formation. It went through the forward shield array, through the primary hull, through 2 internal decks, and out the other side, taking everything in its path with it. The capital ship did not explode immediately. It listed hard to port, venting atmosphere from the wound in its side, and then the secondary reactor caught the shock wave of the structural damage, and the ship came apart from the inside in a slow, terrible bloom of fire and metal. The second shot hit a support vessel amidships. The support vessel simply ceased to exist in any coherent form. The third shot hit the flagship. Zethrak felt it as a physical blow that went through the entire ship. A massive, bone-deep shudder that knocked officers off their feet and sent loose equipment flying across the command deck and made the lights go out for 3 full seconds before the emergency systems kicked back in. When the lights came back on, when 3 of his bridge consoles were dark and Kreth was on the floor with a cut across his forehead, and the damage report system was screaming in multiple voices about hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. Zethrak grabbed a handhold and stayed on his feet and looked at the main screen. The Nemesis was still coming. It was close enough now that it filled most of the forward viewport. A wall of dark, scored armor moving through space with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. He could see the detail of the individual plates, the long railgun spines tracking and resetting, the blue glow of the engine arrays reflecting off the nearest asteroids. He could see the scarring from the Vorkai fire, the glowing patches and the scored lines, and he could see that none of it had reached anything vital. None of it had slowed anything. The Nemesis had walked through everything the fleet had thrown at it and was now close enough to have an opinion about individual ships. It had opinions. 3 more capital ships died in the next 4 minutes. Not quickly. The Nemesis did not waste shots. Each railgun round was precisely placed. Engine arrays, shield generators, weapon systems. It was not shooting to destroy. It was shooting to disable, to cripple, to render the fleet unable to fight while preserving the hulls and the crews inside them. The precision of it was more frightening than pure destruction would have been. Pure destruction was anger. This was something else. This was deliberate. This was controlled. This was a species that had decided exactly how much force was necessary and was applying exactly that amount, no more, with the calm efficiency of long practice. Seath was not at his sensor station anymore. He was standing against the back wall of the command deck with his hands flat against the surface behind him, his yellow eyes fixed on the main screen, his jaw slightly open. He had forgotten entirely that he was a soldier. He was just a living thing looking at something that had fundamentally changed the size of the world he thought he lived in. Several other officers were in similar states. The ones who were still at their stations were operating on training alone, their higher functions occupied entirely with trying to process what was happening. The Vorkai were not cowards. Every being on that command deck had volunteered for military service, had trained for years, had faced combat before. They were not afraid of fighting. They were afraid of this specific thing, this particular scale of thing, in the way that any living creature is afraid when it comes face to face with something that makes it feel, for the first time, genuinely small. Zethrak opened a channel to Dominion High Command. He needed orders. He needed guidance. He needed someone further up the chain to tell him what to do with a situation that his entire career had not equipped him to handle. The channel opened. He heard static, communication lag. The distance was too great for a real-time response. Whatever he sent would take too long to arrive and too long to be answered. He was alone. His fleet was alone. And the nemesis was still coming. Kreth pulled himself up from the floor and stood beside Zethrak, blood drying on the side of his face, his eyes on the screen. He said nothing for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, "We cannot hurt it." "I know," Zethrak said. "I know our guns are not going to kill it." "I know." "Then what do we do?" Zethrak looked at the nemesis. He looked at his damage reports. He looked at the 300,000 ground troops sitting in their carrier holds, waiting to be deployed on a planet they were never going to reach. He looked at the human warships that had reappeared on the flanks, cutting off retreat on both sides, a position not to attack but to contain, to make sure nothing ran until the nemesis had finished what it came to do. He thought about the Elhari diplomat. He thought about her words. He thought about how easily he had dismissed them. He thought about 43 conquered systems and how proud he had been of every one of them, and how that pride felt right now in this moment. Standing on a damaged bridge looking at a ship that had absorbed everything his fleet could produce and had not even found it interesting. And for the first time in his life, Commander Zethrak of the Vorkai Dominion felt something he had never felt in 9 campaigns and 30 years of war. He felt genuinely, completely, and entirely afraid, not of dying. He had made his peace with dying long ago. He was afraid of something else. He was afraid because he finally understood what the silence had meant when they entered the system. He finally understood what the controlled retreats had meant, and the asteroid belt, and the mines, and the years of preparation. He finally understood what the Elhari had been trying to tell him. Humanity had not been hiding because it was afraid. Humanity had been hiding because it was waiting, because it was patient, because it had spent 10,000 years learning how to fight things bigger than itself, and it had looked at the Vorkai Dominion and done the math and decided exactly what to build and exactly how to use it and exactly when to show it. The nemesis fired again. 2 more ships went dark. The woman's voice came back over the comm, still calm, still unhurried, as though she were discussing something administrative. "Your fleet is crippled. Your path to Earth is closed. I will not offer this again. Out of leave, now!" Zethrak looked at his remaining ships. He looked at his dead. He looked at the screen. And for the first time in his life, he gave an order that he had never given before. In 9 campaigns across 30 years of war, not once, not ever. "All ships," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Disengage. Prepare for jump. We are leaving." The silence on the command deck was complete. And then, one by one, his officers turned back to their stations and began the work of getting what was left of the fleet out of the Sol system alive. No one cheered. No one spoke. They worked in the quiet, careful way of people who have just understood something large and terrible and true, and are still in the process of deciding what to do with that understanding. Behind them, the nemesis stopped firing. It held its position. It watched them go. It did not pursue. It did not fire a final salvo at the retreating ships. It simply watched, dark and enormous and patient, as the remnants of the fleet that had come to take the solar system turned away and ran. It had made its point. It did not need to make it twice. The jump back to Vorkai space took 4 days. They were the longest 4 days of Zethrak's life. He spent most of them in his command chair, not sleeping, not eating much. Watching the damage reports update themselves on the screen in front of him, with the slow, steady rhythm of bad news that never quite ran out. Of the 15 capital ships that had entered the Sol system, 9 remained. Of those 9, only 3 were fully operational. The other 6 were limping. Engines at reduced power, weapons offline or partially destroyed, hull breaches sealed with emergency foam and prayers. Of the 41 support vessels, 22 had made the jump. 11 of the missing 19 had been destroyed. The other 8 had been too damaged to jump at all and had been left behind, their crews transferred to other ships in the frantic minutes before the fleet disengaged. He did not know what the humans would do with those abandoned ships. He suspected they would be studied very carefully. The casualties were somewhere above 40,000. The exact number kept changing as medical teams worked through the carriers and the damaged ships, finding the living, counting the dead, updating the lists. 40,000 Vorkai soldiers who had left their home system expecting an easy campaign and had instead found something that rewrote the meaning of the word easy in permanent ink. Zethrak sat with those numbers and said very little to anyone. Kreth came to sit with him on the second day, the dried blood clean from his face, a bandage above his left eye where the cut had been sealed. He brought 2 cups of hot liquid and set one beside Zethrak without being asked. They sat together in silence for a while, the way soldiers sit together after something bad. Not because talking helps, but because being alone is worse. "I keep thinking about the targeting system," Kreth said eventually. Zethrak looked at him. "The fact that it was too large," Kreth said, "that our computers tried to categorize it as terrain." He turned the cup in his hand slowly. "We built those targeting systems to handle the largest warships we had ever encountered. We thought we had covered every possibility. We thought we knew what the upper limit looked like." He paused. "We didn't know. We had no idea." "No," Zethrak agreed. "How long do you think they had been building it?" Zethrak had thought about this during the long, empty hours of the jump. He had done the math in his head, estimating construction times for a vessel of that scale, and accounting for the materials required, the workforce, the engineering. 20 years, he said, possibly more, for that one ship alone. And they said there were more. Zethrak said nothing. He did not need to confirm it. They had both seen the same intelligence briefing, the one that had come through on the 3rd day of the jump from a Vorkai spy embedded in a neutral trading station near the edge of the Sol system. And the spy had managed to intercept a fragment of human military communication. Not much, just a piece, but enough. Enough to confirm that the Nemesis was the oldest of 8, that somewhere in the dark of the Sol system, 7 more ships like it were sitting and waiting. 8 war titans. He had read that number several times. He had tried to imagine 8 of them moving together in a single formation. 8 of those dark, armored, patient things crossing space in a line. And he had stopped trying because the image his mind produced was too large and too terrible to hold comfortably. "What are you going to tell the council?" Kreth asked. "Everything," Zethrak said. "Exactly what happened. Exactly what we saw. Every number, every reading, every detail." He looked at his old friend. "I am not going to soften it or frame it or find a diplomatic way to present it. They need to understand what is in that system. They need to understand it completely, and they need to understand it now." Kreth nodded slowly. "They will not enjoy hearing it." "No," Zethrak said. "They will not." The fleet arrived at Zethra Prime on the morning of the 5th day. There was no welcome. There were no crowds. Word had traveled ahead of them through the Dominion's communication network, and by the time the battered ships settled into their docking positions around the command moon, yet the High Council already knew the broad shape of what had happened. They did not know the details. They did not yet know about the targeting systems, or the mines, or the asteroid platforms, or the 44 railgun spines running the full length of a ship too large for their computers to classify as a vessel. They learned all of it in the council chamber 2 hours after Zethrak's boots touched solid ground for the first time in weeks. The council chamber was a grand room. It had been built to impress, with high ceilings and walls covered in the flags of every conquered system, and a long table of black stone at its center, around which the 9 members of the High Council sat in their formal robes. It was a room designed to make those who entered it feel small, and those who sat at the table feel large. Zethrak had been in it 3 times before, each time to receive commendations for successful campaigns. Each time he had felt the room's weight and had stood straighter under it, proud to be there, proud of what he had done. He did not feel proud this time. He stood at the end of the long black table and he told them everything. He spoke for 2 hours without notes because he did not need notes. Every detail was burned into his memory with the permanent clarity of things experienced under extreme fear. He described the silence when they entered the system. He described the retreat that was not a retreat. He described the asteroid belt and the platforms and the mines and the 6 ships lost in the Shepherd's Pass. He described the contact that appeared from Jupiter's shadow. He described the capital cannon fire hitting the armor and doing nothing. He described the railgun volleys that crippled his capital ships with single shots. He described the human voice on the comm, calm and unhurried, offering one chance to leave. He described the moment he gave the order to disengage. When he finished, the council chamber was silent. The 9 members of the High Council sat very still around their black stone table. Several of them were looking at the footage on the screens that had been playing alongside his testimony. Gun camera recordings from several different ships, all showing the same thing from different angles. The Nemesis emerging from Jupiter's shadow, taking fire, firing back, were destroying ships with the systematic calm of something that was not angry, not frightened, simply working. Fleet Master Voron, who had given Zethrak his assignment with such casual confidence, was staring at the footage with an expression that had nothing casual in it at all. His pale scales had gone almost white. His old eyes moved slowly over the image of the Nemesis, tracing its length. And Zethrak could see him doing the same calculation that every person did when they saw it for the first time. Trying to find a frame of reference, trying to place it in a category, failing. 8, said Council Elder Marath, the oldest member of the council, in a voice barely above a whisper. You said 8. That is the intelligence we received, Elder, Zethrak said. 8 vessels of this class. The one we encountered is the oldest. Honey, they have been building more. Marath sat back in her chair slowly. She was very old, older than any other active council member, old enough that her scales had gone from green to a pale silver gray. She had seen a great many things in her long life. She had watched the Dominion grow from 12 systems to 43. She had never in all of that long life looked the way she looked right now. The El Hari warned us, she said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact, stated quietly. Poirm, the way old people state facts that younger people should have listened to earlier. No one at the table responded to that. There was nothing useful to say. Varun cleared his throat. The tactical picture, he said, pulling himself back to the practical with visible effort. What is your assessment, Commander? Is a second campaign advisable? Zethrak looked at him. No, he said, it is not. With a larger fleet, Fleet Master, Zethrak said, and something in his voice made Voron stop. And I watched our capital cannons hit that ship 12 times in the first volley. Full power, clean impacts. The armor absorbed every shot. I watched our continuous fire over the course of a sustained engagement do cosmetic damage to the outer plating. Surface scarring, nothing more. He paused. That was one ship. If we return with a larger fleet, there will be more of them. And we now know that they have been preparing for this engagement for years, possibly decades. Fully everything we would think to try, they have already thought of and built a counter for. A second campaign would not produce a different result. It would produce the same result with more ships and more dead. Varun was quiet. Furthermore, Zethar continued, we must consider what we do not know. We know about the 8 war titans. We do not know what else they have that we have not yet seen. The mines and the platforms in the asteroid belt were a complete surprise. Yet we had no intelligence on them. None. If they managed to hide those for 11 years, what else have they hidden? What are they not showing us yet? He let that question sit in the air of the chamber for a moment. I would strongly advise the Council to open diplomatic communication with the humans immediately, before they decide that the best response to our invasion attempt is not to wait for a second one. The silence that followed was very long. In the weeks that followed, the news spread. The galaxy was not a small place, but information moved through it in the way information always moves. Faster than anyone intended, carried by traders and travelers and diplomats and spies, passed from species to species, growing with each retelling, while somehow also remaining essentially true at its core. The Vorkai fleet had entered the Sol system. The Vorkai fleet had been stopped. A human ship, one human ship, had crippled half the fleet and sent the rest running. Hundred species that had long observed humanity from a cautious distance began quietly updating their assessments. Ambassadors who had been maintaining polite but minimal contact with UEDC suddenly found reasons to request meetings. Trading consortiums that had declined to do business with humans on the grounds that they were too young and too volatile and too unpredictable began reconsidering their position. House because young and volatile and unpredictable had just turned out to mean something rather different than they had assumed. The Al-Hari diplomat, listener of fading stars, sent a single short transmission to the UEDC Communication Center in Geneva. It contained no strategic information, no political proposal, no offer of assistance or alliance. It contained 4 words in clean, careful English that the diplomat had clearly taken some time to compose. It said, "We are glad you exist." Chen read the message in her office above the operations floor. She read it twice. Then she set it aside and went back to the after-action report on her desk, which was 400 pages long and which she was going to read every single word of. Because that was how you learned, and that was how you got better, and that was what you did after a fight, regardless of how the fight had gone. The report was thorough. Human casualties had been remarkably low. The design of the trap, the use of unmanned platforms and automated mines, had meant that most of the dangerous work had been done by machines rather than people. The Nemesis had taken significant cosmetic damage to its forward and upper plating, but had sustained no structural damage and no casualties. Its systems were fully operational. Commander Adeyemi had already filed a request to take it through a full refit and inspection before returning it to standby status, which Chen had approved that morning. She made notes in the margins of the report as she read. Things that had worked exactly as planned, things that had worked better than planned, things that had not worked as well as expected and needed to be revised before the next time, because there would be a next time. Maybe not the Vorkai. She thought they had learned their lesson, or at least learned enough of it to pause for a significant while. But the galaxy was large. There were other species. Some of them were watching right now, drawing their own conclusions, making their own calculations. She was not worried about them, but she was not complacent about them either. Worry and complacency were both useless. Preparation was useful. Preparation was the thing. She finished the report at midnight. She closed the file, stood up from her desk, and walked to the window of her office, which looked out over a valley in the Alps, dark and cold and very quiet at this hour, with a sky full of stars above the mountains. She stood there for a while looking up. Somewhere out there, a battered Vorkai fleet was making its way home through the dark. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was adjusting its understanding of where humanity sat in the order of things. Somewhere in the shadow of Jupiter, 8 war titans floated in the cold, engines warm, weapons charged, waiting with the particular patience of things built by a species that had learned patience the hardest way possible, by surviving long enough to need it. She thought about Zethrak, the Vorkai commander. She did not know his name, but she had seen his face in the gun camera footage, on his command deck, in the moments before his fleet disengaged. She had watched his expression change over the course of the engagement. She recognized the change. She had seen it on human faces, on battlefields, in the moment when a soldier stopped being certain and started being honest with themselves about what they were looking at. She hoped he made it home. She hoped he told his people the truth. She hoped they listened. She turned away from the window and picked up her cold coffee and drank it. Outside, the stars were still and quiet and enormously, incomprehensibly far away, and the valley below was dark. And the Earth turned slowly on its axis the way it had been turning for 4.5 billion years. long before the first human ever raised a weapon against another, long before the first ship ever left its atmosphere, long before any of this had happened or mattered. It had endured everything so far. Ice ages and impacts and wars without number, and the slow grind of geological time. It had produced in the fullness of that time one particular species, stubborn, violent, brilliant, endlessly creative in the application of both destruction and survival. And it had watched that species nearly destroy it, and then stop and then look outward. The Vorkai had come to take it. They had found instead what every other thing that had ever tried to end the human story had eventually found, that the story was not finished, that it had, in fact, barely started, and that the people who lived on that small blue world in an unremarkable system around an ordinary yellow star had been writing it in blood and steel and stubborn refusal to stop for a very long time, and intended to keep writing it for a very long time more. The galaxy knew now, and the galaxy, quietly and without much fanfare, adjusted accordingly.